I've really stepped away in a big way from mainstream media. I do watch some of the alternative media, but this new community, this new tribe I'm talking about, I'm looking at really trying to gather perspectives from people who, I mean, frankly, in the room on Saturday night, probably there would be no other reason for me to be with that group of people other than the fact that we wanted to have open conversation. There was nothing, I would probably meet those people on the street and never think twice that, oh, well, we're going to be at a social event with them, because for all intents and purposes, there's really nothing that we have in common except the desire to explore, articulate, debate, use, again, a bit of a moral compass and talk about what's happening with respect to these different measures and how governments and economies may be affected. I think that one of the things that's happened, I think I absolutely agree with you. We have, it's either them or us. It's a white hat or a black hat.
Yeah.
And forgive me if I hope this isn't going to upset your audience in America, but in Canada we have about 7 national chartered parties.
Yeah.
In America you have 2. It's always a 2-party system.
Right.
Like if we then take a look at a country like Mexico, there at any given time there could be 130 different parties. Now maybe that's clearly too many. Maybe having 2 parties is too few. Maybe having half a dozen is probably about right. But from my simple observation as a Canadian and having worked in the U.S. for decades and on visas and all the rest of it, I don't know if the 2-party system is really serving America well, because you're forced to be a good guy or a bad guy.
Yeah. And, like I have a friend of mine, and we talk a lot about the days when you had Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, who were diametrically opposed politically, but they'd come up and, hey, we're both kind of Irish, so why don't we just drink some whiskey here at the White House and figure out a way to do it? That sort of bipartisanship is a thing of the past. You just don't see it anymore.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And whether it's mainstream media parroting the same story in whatever country you happen to be listening to it, whether it's, I think that the element, there don't seem to be any Walter Cronkites on the horizon.
I was going to bring that up. So I used to teach at the junior college an intro to computers. And that included, the internet and how you get your news. I kind of threw it in there because, there's only so much Microsoft Word and Excel you can talk about. And I go, when I was growing up, and I'm only 10 years behind you, you had 3 networks. There was no CNN yet. Fox hadn't been invented. And, you had ABC, NBC, CBS. And if any one of those guys was wrong, the other 2 would pounce on them until there was no end to it. And those guys spent their whole life because their reputation was based on not making news up, not taking bogus sources. And by the way, they didn't consider themselves an entertainment media, I think, at the time.
Right.
And so as a result, you could kind of get the news. If you look back at an old Walter Cronkite, by today's standards, it was like, boy, that was boring. And it probably was, but you were hearing news and it was, the bias was there to some extent because they're human, but there was this checking, there's check and balance among those 3. Now you have thousands of media. So is that too many versus too few? I don't know. But now it's like you're is coming from.
Agreed. And I'm even seeing more and more situations where, let's say, an anchor in a mainstream media outlet is talking to a reporter, and the reporter's finished reporting the actual, news that they have to report. And then the anchor will say, well, what do you think about this? Or who cares what they think? I'm not here to listen to what they think. I'm here to listen to what they're reporting. They're not qualified to offer an opinion on that. They're there to offer an opinion, really, or not even an opinion, but to report what it is they're witnessing, eyes, ears.
Right. And if you're old enough to remember, like we are, that's called editorial, which is okay, but not if you're positioning it as news.
Right. Right.
And that's where we've really got, now they're not even pretending to be news. They're saying, this is, like the point right there. And it's like, I don't know how many times it's like, well, they got super good cell phone footage And that's why they put this one on, because this isn't news. This is just like a feature piece.
Mm-hmm. So true. And so, again, if we go back to the topic of community and how do we extend ourselves and who do we extend ourselves to, I guess for me, I've always been a bit of a news junkie. It was kind of 6 o'clock, when my father was home, if he wasn't away on course or training or on mission or something, 6 o'clock, this is the world news with Rex Loring. And everyone would be instantly quiet, and we would hear what was going on around the world. It was almost like, a Norman Rockwell kind of thing in front of the old radio. So that was coming from that kind of an upbringing, and then witnessing what I think is a travesty in how news is reported and the bantering and the bickering and so on. It just really degrades the profession. And that would be true whether it was mainstream media or alternative. Right. There's no real room for that, I don't think, in real reporting. But how does it affect communities? I mean, that's really where this gets to. And so, it's almost the same as there's a car accident at an intersection, and there are 4 people each standing on a different corner of the intersection, and the police go up and interview them, and they all have a slightly different story. The only problem today is that we assume that our government, regardless of where you live, that our governments have been acting in the best interests of the citizens. And now we're seeing, I think it's always been the case that governments have had their own agendas, or people within the government have. I mean, people are people, and you can have the best laid plan you want, but as soon as you introduce people, things can go sideways pretty quickly, right? So we've been trained very effectively to, in our minds, legitimize particular pieces of information and particular sources of information without giving it the critical thinking that it's really deserved for centuries. But we're only now awakening to the fact that we should have been doing it. We haven't been doing it. And if that's not true, what else isn't true? So it just begs a lot of questions.
Yeah. And then from a community standpoint, because, one thing, I don't exclude toxic communities. There are communities that, frankly, aren't doing you a whole lot of good. Mm-hmm. You're actually, this tribe, as you're referring to it, you're almost creating, I don't want to call it artificial, but you're inventing a tribe of like-minded thinkers of some sort. Mm-hmm. Something's bringing them together, almost with the idea of, let's not be a toxic or a community that excludes outsiders.
Right. And again, I think that was evidenced when I mentioned earlier, the room was full of people from multiple disciplines, backgrounds, different philosophies on the jab and boosters, and no one was at a disadvantage. It was an open forum for honest dialogue, and people sometimes, having very passionate discussions about how wedded they are to a particular principle and why and so on. And it's always intrigued me to see how people relate to certain things and not other things, or how they relate to one thing and understand it, but they can't see how the same thing could be true in something else. Oh no, it's just restricted to that one thing. So let me give you a quick example. I had a discussion with one person, and we were talking about the pandemic and some of the evidence that's been provided by alternative media about some of the messaging that's come out of these various organizations. And as we began to talk, the individual started saying, well, yeah, but, they have a particular point of view. I said, well, have you followed the money? Do you realize why a particular person may be? We don't know. Far be it from me to get inside the head of somebody else. But could it be that, the money, for example, in Canada, I believe the federal government under our prime minister receives, CBC, I believe, receives about $700 million annually. And he's been on record to say they will say whatever I basically choose for them to say, because we're subsidizing. They are our public mouthpiece, if you will.
Right.
So, it's hard when the prime minister himself says it.
Yeah.
It's not like, well, I heard it from Joe Schmo, who works at the local hockey rink. I mean, this is coming right from the prime minister. So then you start to ask yourself, okay, well, if they haven't been 100% honest with us about that, how does that relate to other things about the environment and about, EV cars and like, where is all this going? What's the agenda? So I find that for me, one way that I get it's hard to regulate the peaks and valleys when you're listening to mainstream media. But if you go out to your tribe, to your community, and they've already done their own footwork, they've investigated their own topics, they have their own biases and their own points of view. But when you mash people together in a civilized environment where they're free to say what they want and can express even personal perceptions and so on of what they're hearing, I think it lends itself to a really rich conversation. And to your point, you saw these two gentlemen providing a point of view on something, and you still basically believe the person you started to believe, but you have a new appreciation for his opponent's perspectives. And maybe over time, since our subconscious mind is actually 95% of our brain activity, the conscious mind's only 5%. It may well be that those ideas are stewing and whizzing around in your subconscious that can affect, how you perceive other people and your openness and willingness to engage in conversation with them. So all of that's going on, but it happens so quickly, and much of it's invisible to us on a conscious level.
Yeah. And one of the things that, just to kind of throw something else at you. So in the last year, I have heard, what I would consider very flawed thinking by people who I would otherwise think are very intelligent. Mm-hmm. I mean, to throw the generic one, some people really believe the earth is flat. Some people think that the whole thing to, the Apollo mission to the moon was, made up. Mm-hmm. But just recently, I'm hearing people say, oh, this whole war in Ukraine, they're taking old footage and just repeating it at us. Mm-hmm. And I'm going, really? I mean, that to me, and I'm really willing to hear them out, but it's kind of like, that just seems very flawed to me. And I'm not going to ostracize them. I probably won't have that conversation with them again. But there seems to be this tribal thinking that's prevalent mm-hmm. in different circles. I mean, we have the Trumpsters, and then we have the uber liberals, here in the States. And then you come up with people saying things and you're kind of going, that can't be right. I'm very fortunate. I have a chemical engineer, former roommate from college, who I'm going, talk to me about, sustainability and, the weather and the warming. And he'll tell you the facts. Here's what's really happening. But then you hear people that are just so off that you're going, that's not even like on the fringe of the normal curve. They're like way, way out.
Mm-hmm. So true. I guess we're the culmination of our experiences and interests, and some of it comes to us by design, and some is just serendipity and dumb luck, good luck or bad luck. It's hard to say sometimes. But we are still left with the challenge of processing it and trying to make sense of it and see where it fits in our, if we think of explicit and tacit knowledge is more the factual kinds of things, and tacit knowledge is things that we have a framework for, but it's not necessarily a bit or a byte or one or a zero. It may be more qualitative in nature. And so the challenge is, how do we take what the topic, the subject that we've been introduced to, especially if it's something that is contrary to our fundamental set of beliefs, and process it in a way that it really gives us an opportunity to rigorously challenge it and see what shakes out at the end. And that's a discipline. That's not something you come to, by accident. It's something I think you really have to approach with intention. And I'm fortunate that in my tribe, in my growing network and tribe, that there are more and more people, I believe, that are critical thinkers and listeners. So
yeah, without an attachment to a perceived result.
Typically I'll have like the conversation I had the other night with the gentleman who was the first responder. I just walked away from that going, well, that's really interesting. I can see from his perspective, I have a much better appreciation for what an average day looks like for him,
Yeah.
what kind of decisions he has to make, not only on life and death with patients, but how he interacts with the system that has mandated certain things. And how does he embrace it? Where does he see the sticky points are? How does he navigate around it or through it or under it or over it or whatever he has to do?
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of discussions that I'm very curious about.
Good. Well, man, I think that was quite an adventurous conversation, very different from what I typically have. Yeah, we're kind of running out of time, Gary, but man, I really appreciate this. It's got all my cogs, spinning, and I'm sure a lot of people listening will feel the same.
Thank you, George. It's been a pleasure.
Good. Well, hey, you have a good one, and stay warm up there in the cold regions.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.
All the best.